It began not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper. A murmur in Brussels faint enough to be ignored, yet carrying the weight of an economic bombshell. Hidden behind the polished doors of NATO, Donald Trump stood before his allies and delivered a chilling demand: raise tariffs on Africa. Make them bend or watch them starve. The target was no secret: Africa's raw lifeblood, oil and gold. Two resources without which Western economies would stumble overnight. For Washington, this was strategy. For Africa, it was a threat dressed up as diplomacy, a demand to surrender sovereignty or face suffocation. But in Ouagadougou, the reaction was very different. Ibrahim Traoré did not flinch. He named it plainly economic warfare. And instead of bowing, he prepared to resist. What followed would rattle NATO's unity, shake Europe's markets, and awaken millions across Africa to the reality of their power. Imagine the scene: a single sheet of paper slipped from the hands of a conscience-stricken European official into the world of journalism, ignited a firestorm that raced across continents. Within hours, headlines screamed, "Europe targets Africa's oil and gold." In classrooms, in markets, in crowded squares, the same question rose: how long will we allow others to dictate our future? This is not just a story about tariffs. It is about dignity, control, and the struggle of an entire continent to decide its own fate. And at the center of it all stands a young captain from Burkina Faso, daring to tell the West that Africa will no longer kneel. So stay with me until the end of this video, because what began as a whisper has grown into a roar that could change the balance of power forever. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's defiance is the start of true independence, or a dangerous gamble against the strongest powers in the world? Comment your thoughts below. And if you believe Africa deserves the right to stand tall, hit subscribe, because here we put truth before headlines. The story begins with a single leak. A page slipped from the guarded halls of Brussels into the hands of a journalist who dared to publish what most would never believe. Washington had pressured its NATO allies to prepare a plan: raise tariffs on Africa's oil and gold until the continent bowed its head in dependence once again. The memo was blunt, the targets precise. Africa's lifeblood, oil from the Sahel and gold from Burkina Faso and Mali, were to be strangled under a cloak of diplomacy. For Western leaders, it was a calculated strategy. For Africa, it was nothing less than an act of war. Within hours of publication, the revelation raced through African capitals like wildfire. Newspapers from Lagos to Bamako carried the same headline: Europe targets Africa's oil and gold. On social media, young voices erupted with disbelief and fury. In Accra, a university student wrote, "They don't want partnership, they want chains." In Dakar, a young mother tweeted, "Will our children always pay the price for Europe's greed?" Suddenly, the quiet corridors of power were mirrored by loud, restless voices on the streets. In Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasted no time. Before dawn, he summoned his closest advisors to the presidential palace. The room was tense but resolute. Traoré, with his military fatigues and sharp gaze, cut through the silence. "This isn't about tariffs. This is about control. They want our oil, they want our gold, and they want our sovereignty. If we bow today, we will be slaves tomorrow." His words were not rhetorical flourishes. They were the opening shot of a new kind of battle, one not fought with bullets, but with contract sanctions and the raw weight of markets. By mid-morning, urgent calls reached across the Sahel, to Mali, to Niger, to Guinea. Traoré was not calling diplomats. He was calling leaders who understood what was at stake: the dignity of an entire continent. Within days, a secret summit was convened, not in Geneva, not in Paris, but in the heart of West Africa. Behind closed doors, leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States AS gathered with a singular purpose. The discussions were raw, emotional, and unfiltered. A Malian official spoke of gold siphoned off through shadow contracts signed in colonial times. A Nigerian minister reminded the room that more than half of France's electricity grid still depended on uranium mined from Nigerian soil, while Nigerian villages remained without power. A Guinean representative described oil revenues vanishing into foreign bank accounts while local schools crumbled. For decades, Africa's leaders had been forced to negotiate on their knees, begging for aid, while their natural wealth fueled foreign prosperity. But this time felt different. The air was thick with anger, but also with resolve. For the first time in living memory, the conversation was not about concessions, it was about power. Then Traoré spoke. His voice was steady, almost surgical. If they dare to impose tariffs, then we must dare something greater. We will shut down the flow of oil and gold to their markets, and we will find new partners who respect us." The room fell into silence. Leaders looked at one another, weighing the enormity of what had just been proposed. Cutting off oil and gold would risk retaliation. It would mean hardship at home. But one by one, heads began to nod. The silence broke into applause, hesitant at first, then thunderous. The decision was dangerous, perhaps even reckless in the eyes of the West. But it was also historic. Word of the summit's decision did not spread through official communiques. It came through whispers in marketplaces, fragments of speeches replayed on radios, and chants in crowded squares. In Bamako, merchants told each other, "If they want our gold, they must take our dignity too." In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, a student lifted a sign, "Better hunger for a year than slavery for a century." The crowd roared and the chant echoed into the night. The leak from Brussels had started as a whisper, but by the time Africa answered, it had become a roar. For the first time, the continent was not simply reacting, it was setting the terms of engagement. The decision of the AES summit sent shockwaves far beyond West Africa. When word spread that the Sahel leaders had agreed to shut down oil and gold exports if tariffs were imposed, the mood across the continent transformed. Fear mingled with pride, anxiety with defiance. For decades, Africa had been told that it was powerless in the global system. Now, for the first time, its leaders were daring to pull the plug on the very resources that kept Europe alive. Markets in Europe reacted instantly. In Frankfurt, gold prices spiked like a rocket traders staring at their screens in disbelief as red numbers turned into panic. In Paris, energy planners whispered what no one wanted to admit publicly: more than half of France's nuclear grid depended on uranium from Niger. Without it, the lights would dim. In Milan, executives from electric car companies huddled in emergency meetings, realizing that without cobalt and lithium from the Congo, their entire green revolution could stall before it even began. The fear was no longer abstract. It was financial oxygen slipping away. In the streets of Africa, however, the atmosphere was electric. Across Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, rallies erupted. Crowds waved handmade signs, "No dignity, no gold." Better hunger today than slavery tomorrow. Mothers marched with their children. Students filled public squares chanting into the night. What began as political whispers had become a people's movement. For once, governments and citizens spoke the same language: resistance. Then came the moment that crystallized the crisis. One evening, national television cut into regular programming. The screen faded to black, and then Ibrahim Traoré appeared, not surrounded by generals or ministers, but by ordinary workers, miners with dust still clinging to their faces, farmers with calloused hands, engineers with worn jackets. They stood shoulder to shoulder behind him as he spoke. His voice was calm, unpolished, but unshakable. "They say we are reckless. I say we are free. Oil and gold do not belong to Europe. They belong to Africa. And from this day forward, they will no longer flow without dignity." Those words echoed across radios in remote villages and across smartphones in bustling cities. The symbolism was powerful, a president not speaking above his people but standing among them. In Lagos, murals appeared overnight showing barrels of oil wrapped in African flags. In Kinshasa, marketplaces erupted in cheers as the speech replayed. Across the diaspora in Paris, London, New York, young Africans posted one phrase again and again: "If Traoré stands, we stand." But as Africa roared, Washington doubled down. At rallies, Donald Trump thundered before cheering crowds promising to teach Africa its place. He framed the crisis as a test of Western dominance. Yet in Europe, cracks widened. Some leaders insisted they had to follow America's line. Others stared at graphs showing refinery shutdowns and bullion shortages, whispering that sanctions against Africa might boomerang with devastating speed. A German minister warned privately, "If we sanction them, we sanction ourselves." His words never made the official transcript, but they circulated in corridors like a warning bell. Meanwhile, BRICS nations moved with precision. Beijing announced emergency credit lines for African exporters. Moscow offered joint ventures in gold refining. New Delhi pledged to buy Sahelian crude in long-term contracts. Each move reassured African capitals that they would not stand alone. The high point of the confrontation was not on a battlefield, but in the hearts of people. Africa had been threatened with starvation. Instead, its leaders stood tall, its people rallied, and its allies abroad stepped forward. What was meant to fracture the continent was now welding it together. The climax was clear. A whisper from Brussels had unleashed a storm that neither Washington nor Brussels could control. Africa was no longer begging for survival. It was demanding respect. The counterpunch from the West came swiftly. Banks in Europe froze the accounts of state-owned companies from Burkina Faso and Mali. Oil tankers and bullion shipments were held up in Mediterranean ports, their paperwork suddenly declared under review. Western insurance giants refused to cover African cargo, leaving exporters stranded. And in cyberspace, shadowy hacker units probed the government servers of Ouagadougou and Bamako, disrupting payments, crashing websites, and sowing digital chaos. On television screens across Europe, coordinated media campaigns painted Traore as reckless, a populist strongman dragging his nation toward ruin. Editorials warned of famine, of collapse, predicting that ordinary Africans would soon turn against their leaders. Yet on the ground, the reality unfolded very differently. Yes, prices rose. Families in Ouagadougou lined up longer for cooking oil. Pharmacies reported shortages of imported medicine. Parents worried whether they could afford school fees as the local currency felt the strain. The hardship was real and no one denied it. But what shocked even seasoned observers was how communities responded. Instead of fracturing, neighborhoods began to close ranks. Volunteers distributed food to rural villages. Students created solidarity networks to keep schools running. Farmers pooled resources to move their harvests to markets without relying on foreign contractors. In Niamey, youth groups set up community kitchens feeding hundreds with what little they had. The message was clear: Africa would not be broken by pressure it had endured in one form or another for centuries. At the political level, the AS leaders turned crisis into strategy. Resource convoys were now escorted by joint security patrols. In Mali and Niger, local engineers worked overnight to stabilize power grids vulnerable to cyber attacks. Burkina Faso announced the creation of a national reserve fund, stocked with oil and gold revenues to keep essential services alive. Regional banks began experimenting with gold-backed payment systems to bypass Western transfers altogether. These were not desperate improvisations. They were seeds of sovereignty. But hardship also hardened public resolve. In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, a mother of three held a placard that read, "We have eaten hunger before, but never dignity. Let us suffer with honor." In Bamako, protesters marched outside the French embassy chanting, "No more hidden chains." Opposition parties in Europe seized on these images, demanding their governments explain why European workers should lose jobs to enforce Washington's tariff war. The political fallout was no longer confined to Africa. It was ricocheting back into Europe's own capitals. For Africa, the civil strain was undeniable. Families carried heavier burdens. But rather than eroding faith in their leaders, the sacrifices became proof that the governments were truly defending them from the century-old pattern of plunder. When investigative journalists revealed secret draft contracts that would have privatized African oil and gold under emergency stabilization programs, outrage exploded. What began as anger turned into clarity. This was never about tariffs. It was about theft. The civil and political consequences fused into a single narrative: hardship. Yes, but hardship with meaning. For once, the suffering was not born of corruption or neglect. It was a chosen resistance, a deliberate stand against domination. And that distinction reshaped how millions saw themselves and their leaders. Across villages and cities, an unshakable idea took root: better to endure short-term pain than to surrender an entire future. In Washington, the crisis was framed as a test of dominance. At rallies broadcast worldwide, Donald Trump thundered promises to teach Africa its place. To his base, it was a show of strength. But to diplomats and analysts, the tone revealed something else: anxiety. The United States, long accustomed to dictating global trade terms, now faced the reality that its leverage over Africa's oil and gold was slipping. Behind closed doors, American advisors assured NATO allies that Africa would crawl back once their treasuries ran dry. Yet, the data on European desks told a different story. Refinery shutdowns loomed, gold shortages rattled banking systems, auto plants worried about cobalt supplies drying up. A German minister quietly warned colleagues, "If we sanction them, we sanction ourselves." The remark never entered official transcripts, but it echoed through the corridors of Brussels. Europe was no longer speaking with one voice. France pushed for unity with Washington, desperate to maintain control over uranium lifelines from Niger. Italy fretted over energy supplies from the Sahel. Germany, already shaken by industrial decline, resisted any policy that might deepen its crisis. What was meant to be a united Western front fractured into competing fears. Meanwhile, in the global South, the reaction was starkly different. In Beijing, officials announced emergency credit lines for African exporters, bypassing Western banks. In Moscow, delegations offered joint ventures in oil refining and gold mining, promising that no Western tariff could touch resources once they were rebranded under Eurasian contracts. India stepped forward with long-term commitments to purchase Sahelian crude, providing markets that Europe thought it controlled. Each move signaled to Washington that Africa was no longer cornered. Across Latin America and Asia, commentators framed the confrontation as a turning point. In Brazil, activists compared Traoré's defiance to their own battles against resource exploitation. In Indonesia, headlines praised Africa for breaking the cycle of dependency. Internationally, what began as a regional dispute over tariffs was transforming into a referendum on the global order itself. For the American public, the story trickled in through headlines that often painted Traoré as reckless. Yet in diaspora communities from New York to Atlanta, many African Americans and Caribbean voices saw something familiar. They recognized in Africa's struggle echoes of their own history of resistance to systemic control. Social media buzzed with a single phrase: "If Africa stands, we stand." The broader implication was clear. Every sanction, every attempted embargo, every smear campaign had failed to break Africa's resolve. Instead, they exposed Western dependence. Oil and gold, once seen as commodities under Western command, now appeared as levers of power in African hands. For Washington and Brussels, the nightmare was not just economic disruption, it was symbolic. The more they pressed, the more Africa's leaders looked less like rebels and more like pioneers of a new sovereignty. The balance of power was shifting, and the world was watching. What began as a whisper in Brussels had swelled into a storm that neither Washington nor Brussels could contain. The leaked memo, the summit in Ouagadougou, the bold declaration from Ibrahim Traoré, all of it converged into a single truth. Africa was no longer willing to kneel. The West tried every weapon short of war sanctions, cyber attacks, media campaigns, even covert contracts. Yet instead of breaking Africa, the pressure hardened its resolve. Yes, families tightened their belts, medicines ran short, and prices climbed. But across villages and cities, the sacrifice carried meaning. For once, the suffering was not seen as weakness, but as proof of dignity. And that dignity became a shield stronger than any army. In Europe, the realization was chilling. Their industries, their energy grids, their banking systems all leaned on Africa more than they had ever admitted. In America, Trump's bravado played well at rallies, but diplomats quietly acknowledged that something historic was happening. Africa was no longer a passive recipient of orders. It was a force rewriting the rules. This is where the story widens. The standoff over oil and gold is not just about Africa. It is about a global system cracking under the weight of its own arrogance. If the West could attempt to starve Africa into submission, who will be next? And if Africa succeeds in turning this crisis into sovereignty, how long before other regions follow the same path? Standing before the flags of the Sahel Alliance, Traoré's words carried further than any weapon they thought hunger would silence us. Instead, it awakened us. From this day forward, Africa is not a marketplace. They will meet us as equals or not at all. Those words are more than a speech. They are a warning that the old order is ending. A warning that dignity once awakened cannot be buried again. And perhaps most importantly, a warning that the next chapter of global history may not be written in Washington or Brussels, but in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. Now I ask you, do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's strategy of turning hardship into dignity can truly reshape Africa's destiny? Or will Western pressure eventually force the continent back into submission? Please share this video if you believe Africa's dignity is worth more than gold. And subscribe if you know that the truth matters more than headlines. Because together we can make sure these voices are not silenced.